Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon of the Chabad House of Delmar, and we have a very, very special guest with us today, Mrs. Ruth Mendel. Ruth, can I call you Ruth? Be informal. Welcome to the Jewish View.
I'm delighted to be here.
Now, you're a prominent member of the Delmar Jewish community, Delmar community in general, but surely Jewish community, and but I brought you on and tell our viewers a very interesting history that you have. And usually you speak for the Jewish Federation of Holocaust Survivors.
Yes, I do.
So that's,
yes, I do.
And I want to, we have a more expansive, should I say, thousands of people watching us on the Jewish View.
Yes.
But, expansive, but it is a very interesting story. So tell us about that.
Well, I suppose the reason I'm really here is because I had, if I may say so, a wonderful conversation with someone in the community who discovered that my story is one of an immigrant, refugee, but a refugee of many years ago during the Hitler era. I was born in Luxembourg and lived in the city of Luxembourg, in the country of Luxembourg, which is
a very small city.
Very small country in between Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and I lived a very nice life. My family originally came, I was born there, but my parents and my mother's parents and sister and brother were born in Poland. My father was also. And through circumstances, they wound up in Luxembourg. When they arrived there, it was following the First World War. They were a poor family from when they arrived. They had actually come under different circumstances to Luxembourg and had to start from the ground up in terms of making a living. My father had a job they're big in the steel industry, coal industry, and so that's where he had a job. And my grandfather as well. But my grandparents were very enterprising, and so they would buy merchandise here and there, and on farm days, or what do you call it, farmers market days, which they had a lot in those days, they would open up a little stand and sell the merchandise out in the market way. And my mother and her sister would help. My uncle at the time was still very young and was not very participatory. But my grandparents were very frugal. They saved their money over the years and then finally rented a storefront in the city of Luxembourg. Their storefront was right in the city, immediately opposite the Ducal Palace.
Oh, nice place, probably.
Very nice. It was a dry goods store where they sold everything from knitting yarns to uniforms to many, many things. And they worked very hard, and they finally came out of poverty, which they had experienced and why they left Poland. And so things were going along very nicely. I lived a very normal life. I went to school. My dad had his job. My mother worked with my grandparents in the store, my aunt also, and so everything was very normal. I was a child, so I certainly was not aware of political goings-on around France and Luxembourg at that time. So my story really begins when I was about 9 years old. We were invaded the morning of May 10th, 1940.
Just to back up, maybe you're the first person I ever met from Luxembourg. But,
probably.
But how was the situation? Was it anti-Semitic, your parents ever said?
No.
I mean, just the scenery before the war.
Okay, thank you. I'll be happy to say that as far as I was concerned, Luxembourg was a Catholic country. So all the festivities were always centered around Christian holidays, I should say. And so, but we never experienced, I personally didn't, I never heard my parents or grandparents speak about anti-Semitic things, anti-Semitism, and we had a synagogue in Luxembourg, and so I had never experienced it, neither in school nor with friends. We had friends who were Gentiles, and we never really experienced it. And my grandparents, because they were business people, certainly knew a lot of people who came, and there was no, to me at age 9, I was by that time 8 to 9 years old, I certainly didn't know any anti-Semitism.
It's interesting
But
to frame that, to know that.
it is,
there
the
was-
atmosphere.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't. But there is an interesting little note, as you'll hear as I move along, because the morning of May 10th, Luxembourg, as well as the Netherlands and France, were invaded. I mean, it's just literally an overnight invasion.
The same invasion of France was Luxembourg. That same.
Exactly.
was
We were in the
one.
same boat. And so I was sleeping. I don't remember if it was a school day or not, but my mother came and she shook me awake. We lived in a small 3-room apartment in an apartment building which was looked out on a square, which had a statue with a horse, someone on a horse, called, in Luxembourg, because it's so close to France, so close to Germany, and it was at one time more Germanic, German and French were the languages that were spoken, and many of the streets and places would be called by their French or German name, depending on who you were.
Is there any Luxembourg language? Or
Yes, there is.
Really?
There is. It's kind of a lowlands language, which is a little patois of German, mixture of German, and that was. But it was not used. And in school, we had books that were both in German, French, depending what we were. So she woke me up, and I wondered why. It seemed kind of early, and she said, "Just get dressed. We have to go to your grandparents' house." Now, my grandparents, the way the city is, it's like divided by a valley, and so there are all these viaducts that cross from one part of the city to the other. Where my grandparents lived was sort of the center at the time of finance and whatnot, the buildings that were there, and she just wanted us to go there. So I had to get dressed, and the 3 of us, my father and I, before we left, I looked out the window, and the entire square was covered with German army vehicles of all
kinds. They took over overnight, you're
overnight.
saying?
It was virtually
really?
overnight. They were not there the night before, but they were there that morning. So there we are. We have to leave. I gather my parents felt that the important thing was for us to be together. They had no idea of what we were going to do. Certainly things didn't look very good. So we came downstairs, and down in the same building that we lived in, these were all sort of connected apartment buildings, but there was a little alleyway where there was a coffee shop. A coffee shop where we would stop every so often. My parents would go in for a cup of coffee. It was right close to our building. And so they would have coffee, and I would have a dish of ice cream, and everybody was always very nice. We come down that morning, the 3 of us. My parents, I'm sure, were just anxious to get going. And we walked across. We had no car, so everything was walking distance for us. But we came downstairs, and the gentleman who owned that coffee shop, who had always been very friendly to us, saw the 3 of us and said to us, "Now it's going to go."
Really?
And that was the first anti-Semitic thing that I had ever experienced. And I don't know about my parents, but they certainly never experienced anything like that. But here was a man who had been very cordial with us, and we had no clue that now he felt very empowered to do this, and said that.
That's why I'm trying to get at even my first question of where this anti-Semitism comes in. Like, that's what I'm wondering. I'm just saying, you say they're cordial, and then all of a sudden they're ready to.
Well, he obviously,
be mean.
just like in our country sometimes, You find people who harbor certain feelings but don't have the, because we're the country we are and we don't really want this kind of thing, and we fight against it in terms of having laws and things that prevent people from doing it. We have now anti-hate laws and what have you, hate speech. So, but in those days, he felt we were just customers, and he felt he couldn't say anything. But now, and he may have been of German background, I don't know enough about him per se, but because now these must have been his feelings all along, but now he had the sanction of the German, the Wehrmacht that was there in the square. I mean, he was totally protected by who was there.
It's also, they knew it wasn't, you're next door to Germany, and if you say 1940, so it's 7 years where Hitler's spewing out all his hatred, so
sure.
Maybe you were a child, you didn't know it, but probably
right. Oh,
every
of course
person
I didn't know
knew.
it.
Everybody else knew that the Germans hated the Jews.
Yes, they did. But and he may just have, for some reason that we never can understand, why someone has these feelings, these anti-Semitic feelings. It just came to the fore because now he did have the support, and he looked at us and felt that now, anything can happen to us. He didn't know what, but that's what it was. So we did go to my grandparents, and we actually stayed with them. They had a bigger apartment than we did.
Why did your parents feel that was safer?
Just to be together,
Really?
because they felt that, we don't know, they were all adults. I was a child, so I don't know what went on between them. I just know that they probably felt they need to make some decisions, and to make some decisions. We were still, the whole country where my grandparents lived was occupied as well. It's just that we could see the whole thing from our window because they were just all parked there. The whole thing was filled with army vehicles. So, but they just wanted to be together, I think, to discuss what are we going to do. Now, my grandparents had the store, so for a while we stayed with my grandparents, with my aunt, my uncle, my parents, and I, and they continued to run the store. But the first thing that happened was they put, and I don't know the sequence and how long it took before that happened, but let's say this was 1940, and so halfway through the year, before even halfway through the year, I would say a few months later, a big sign came on the store that said Jude, Jew. Big yellow sign on the store.
But you were still working in the store? Not you, but your
yes, the
parents
store,
were still...
at that point, my grandparents were still running the store, and my mother was working there. But the next thing, of course, that happened was that they came and they took the keys away, so they could no longer. This really, we left in November, so between May and November, they were starting to institute more and more rigid laws. My father couldn't go to work. They took the store away. Jewish children could no longer go to school. And so we just sat there. And my grandmother, who was of blessed memory, who was a wonderful woman, very smart, though she had no education to speak of, somehow she found an opportunity. I don't know how she found out about it, but she found out that they were selling exit visas at the Cuban embassy in Belgium, I'm not sure which of the cities, of the bigger cities of Belgium. So she asked because at that point in time there were already refugees from Germany, German Jews who had left, but somehow came to Luxembourg. Instead of leaving for the United States or whatever, perhaps they couldn't, they came to Luxembourg. So my grandparents and my parents knew people, other Jewish people, and they said to them, if you give, my grandmother said, if you give my daughters money for the visas, they will go to Belgium and get the visas, and you will be able to leave. So my mother and my aunt did just that. They collected money from families that we knew, and they went to Belgium with a farmer, a Gentile farmer, who took them. Again, I don't know the background to all of these things. I was a child, and later I was not smart enough to ask the questions one should ask, and now there was no one to ask of them. So they did go. One was supposed to be his wife, the other is her sister. My mother was fair, blue-eyed, didn't attract much attention in that way. And so they came, they went. If they had been caught, all of them would have been, because they had a lot of money they were carrying to buy these visas. He would have been in trouble for doing this for these people, Jews. But they went safely, came home safely. And then we couldn't just distribute the visas, which of course they did, but they distributed the visas, but we were not allowed to leave as individual families. What they were waiting to do was to put together two transports, about 100 people in each transport, families with visas who could leave. And we could leave, but we could leave only with soldiers taking us from step to step. And we'd go by train from Luxembourg to Paris, from Paris to the border of France and Spain, and each night we would stop. And one of the things, well, to go back to Luxembourg for a moment, if I may, when we couldn't go to school anymore, my Jewish friend Friedel and I would walk around the streets during the day. We had nothing to do. And so near my grandparents' home, there was a place where Germans took care of their horses, a stable. They made a stable out of a section of that part of town. And so we'd stand there, we loved horses, and we would watch them groom the horses. And there was a German soldier, not an SS, or he was just a conscripted, probably in Austria, with whom we used to talk all the time, and he would talk to us about whatever, and we could talk about the horses. And he said to me one day, "I don't understand why Hitler hates the Jews." He was just a soldier. He was not in the upper echelons, and he couldn't understand it. And in fact, when the time came and my family had to leave, and her family also, though they were in the next transport, he said, he actually cried. He was sorry to see us go, but he probably knew it was the best thing we could do. So the transports now, my family and I were in the first transport to leave. There were two. We left in the first one, and that meant stopping every night in a different part of, wending our way towards Spain, actually. So we would stay at the border of France and Spain, and then at the border of Spain and Portugal. And we were not allowed to go into Portugal because Salazar didn't want refugees, so we had to wait there. But before getting there, I remember one night we stopped at a train station, and we were told by the soldiers who were our guides that we could, children and older people can go into the train station. They would put down pallets, and they could stay there. And so I remember thinking, but where will my parents be? And I said that to my mother. I said, I don't want to do this unless I'll be with you. So she went into town, which was right there by this train station, and instead of saying, don't be silly, go, and just everybody is there, and no, she went and got us a room, and the three of us stepped in a room in this, what was basically a bar, where the German soldiers were drinking beer and what have you, but the three of us were in a room, and I was satisfied, and that's how we stayed till the morning. And then we got back on the train and headed for Spain. And I often think of that because later on, as most people know by now, what happened when they came to the final solution, that's of course what they did. They separated children from parents. And it often makes me think what a horrifying moment that was for both the parents and the children, because what you want is to be with your parents and to be torn away from them, because no matter what, you feel safe with your parents. When you're not with them, you no longer feel safe. And so that was sort of a precursor to what actually did happen later. But my mother was very smart, and she was not going to, she maybe had that same feeling, so she went and got us the room. And then our next stop was in Spain, and this was just after the Civil War, and so people were very poor. And I remember we stayed in a huge barn of a place, all of us, and overnight, and some of the people who had cigarettes, they were being guarded by Spanish soldiers, and the soldiers would allow them to go out and smoke, and if they offered them cigarettes, which they would do. But we stayed overnight there, and then we got to at that point we came to a border town between Spain and Portugal, and we had to stay there until actually Jewish organizations pressed the government of Portugal to allow these refugees, this group of refugees, to enter. That anyone who entered was not allowed to work. They had to leave within a given time. Now that created a little bit of problem for us, because I was a Luxembourg citizen, just as if I'm born in this country, I'm an American citizen. But my parents were Polish citizens. They were not allowed to become Luxembourg citizens of Luxembourg. So they retained their Polish citizenship. And at that point, we had a quota system in this country, which allowed only so many people from Eastern Europe into this country per month. And so even though my father's family, who were the ones who really took care of us once we arrived in Lisbon, even though they were willing to do anything they could to bring us here, we couldn't leave until my parents and grandparents had that special number. They were allowed in. So my father would go to the embassy every couple of days to see if these numbers had come up. And in the meantime, we lived in Lisbon, and through the kindness of the people of Lisbon and Portugal, we lived in a furnished room. When we first got there, we ate in a soup kitchen that was provided by HIAS, Hebrew Immigration Association. And until we could forge for ourselves, and we couldn't work, no one could work, so we had to then depend on money that came from family in the United States, and which they did do. So we stayed there until that time came, and in the meantime, again, it was Gentile people. The man who was the chef on the train from Paris to Lisbon, who saw this group of refugees, who felt very sorry for them, and when the train would stop at this little frontier town where they wouldn't, before we came into Lisbon, if he had any fruit left over on the train, he would give it to families to give to their children. Very, very nice man. So these people, when we got into Lisbon, he helped us some more. He took these families and helped them out, invited them to a big feast that these people were making, all Gentile, in Lisbon, in Portugal, and they just treated us very nicely. He also paid for me to go to school. In my possession, I still have school books in Portuguese that I was able to use. So we met some really wonderful people along the way, but of course it was a pretty scary time. The story ends in a way because the second transport, if we had been on the second transport, I wouldn't be sitting here talking with you today, because they were sent back. They did not make it out of the country. That was when the government decided that they could not leave.
So how did you get to, you went to America in the end? I mean,
we did, yes. We had to wait for that quota, and my father's family provided the money for the steamship tickets. They sent us money so that we could live, because we really didn't have, we were not allowed to leave with a lot of money. So they were the ones. And then when that moment arrived that we could leave, because now, especially my mother, father, and I, not my grandparents, they still remained in Lisbon. And so we came here and stayed with my father's family and so on until my father and mother were able to start to work and do what we needed to do. But my grandparents, my aunt and my uncle, continued to stay in Lisbon because unfortunately my mother's family was not so quick to respond, and because the Salazar did not want these refugees to remain in Lisbon, they had to leave. They made a deal with the British and sent the remaining Jews who had not left yet, sent them to the British West Indies, to Jamaica, where they had to stay in abandoned barracks until the families in the States could bring them here. So.
A very interesting story. You know, we only have a minute left, or a few minutes left. And
I was hoping I'm not going to
no, it's perfect
get too long
timing.
with it.
And I just really feel that it's really in miracles in certain sense. It's the hand of God that brought you here, because one little thing, the transport one, transport two, you know, one little thing, and God forbid you wouldn't be with us today.
And when I tell the story to young people, I always say it's the story of three courageous women: my grandmother, my mother, my aunt, because if it hadn't been for them, both my grandfather and my father were complacent about things and not ready for making changes, whereas my grandmother, who had already experienced anti-Semitism in Poland, I know that they had, she just knew it wasn't going to be good. And that was this whole business of living with them, talking with them, that helped get us out of there. And so I bless my grandmother's memory all the time.
Sure, it takes a woman. But, you know, I think for the future generations, you know, you should be, you know, healthy and live long, to say the least, Ruth. But, I mean, really, on the other hand, you know, people are getting older. The Holocaust survivors are getting older.
Yes.
And, you know, sometimes, you know, you can always read a history book about George Washington, but, you know, but you have a first-hand account of what's happening, and that's why I wanted you to tell to our viewers, because that's very, very important. And people should know the history, and like we were just saying, where hatred could lead to, you know, and people that, I mean, you have to have a good government, like you say, that they should be beneficial to the people.
And I always tell young people that because it's happening even now, and imagine when there are no more survivors left, how easy it will be to say this never happened. But there are people living right now who actually lived through that time, who are saying this never happened. And how anyone, and then what else I have as part of the story is that my whole father's side of my family, my grandparents on that side, my aunts and uncles and cousins, whom I never got to meet, all perished in the Holocaust, but they were all killed. And I have no clue as to where it was, and so on.
It's unfortunate, but the fortunate thing is you're here. That's what we wanted to say. And I just, not only is it an interesting story, but it's surely educational. I mean, just for Jews and for non-Jews, Jews should know their history, and non-Jews should understand that where, you know, you get a hatred and you think it's maybe, I don't know, cute, but, you know, it's interesting. Well, hate people and doesn't make a difference, but where hate could lead into terrible, terrible consequences. So I want to thank you, Ruth, for coming. It's probably a painful story over here, so to tell about, but it's also hopeful.
It is, and I was one of the lucky ones. So my family and I was spared, so I'm very thankful for that. And I thank you.
And we want to thank you for being here over here. Ruth, only good things.
I thank you for having me. Thank you.